Hey guys, today we are going to talk a little bit more in depth about style, specifically the style that Sandra Cisneros uses in The House on Mango Street. So let's get into it. Now, let's review our year in books. This is the fourth book we will have read this year, and all of the books that we read are extremely different. So we start with the Iliad, right? Epic poetry. I know you guys loved that style of text, right? We follow with The Giver, which is a novel, kind of your typical novel, no big deal. Easiest as far as text and structure go. Next is Shipwreck at the Bottom of the World. It's historic narrative nonfiction, not too difficult, but maybe a little bit dry. Sometimes it's a little bit tricky to get through more of the descriptive part. She talks a lot about, different things that they faced in Antarctica. There isn't a whole lot of dialogue, and so it can sometimes be a little bit harder to get through that type of text. And now we come to House on Mango Street. The question is, what style do we find in House on Mango Street? Well, if you listen to the introduction presentation, I gave it away, but let's get into it because it will introduce an entirely new kind of structure once again. Okay. So, what is style specifically? Style is a particular writer's manner of expression, essentially how they write. And everybody writes differently. Different components of style include things like word choice, saying scarlet, not red, sauntered, not walked, sentence structure. Remember my cat story about Pam and Veronica, right? Remember that? We talked about switching up your sentence structure. Cisneros specifically uses all kinds of different sentence structures, including fragments, run-ons, etc. She uses the whole range of possibilities. Use of literary devices, specifically figurative language. This is where we talked about our similes and our metaphors, personification, etc. Rhythm. Rhythm is something we see more often with poetry, but it can exist in prose as well. And we actually find some different examples of rhythm in this text as well. Rhythm is something that alliteration contributes to, but it also is how the words are put together. Text that reads with any sort of beat, or text that sometimes you just read something that really flows well and you don't get caught up in weird words or words that are too long for the rest of the words that are around it. It's just a really fluid kind of text. That is its own rhythm, and we're going to find that in a lot of what Sandra Cisneros writes in this book. It has a beat, and it almost becomes musical. Other elements of composition also go into style, grammatical tendencies, different preferences in language, those kinds of things. We talked in the introduction video that Sandra Cisneros breaks a lot of grammar rules. And so her grammatical tendency is to not follow grammar rules, which is kind of the antithesis of what we would think of when we think of traditional literature, right? Which is what makes this book so interesting and so fun to read. Many writers have their own particular style, and sometimes you can even tell who you're reading before you even know that it's their text based on how they write. All right, next up. So, vignettes. And I gave you kind of a little intro, like a mini intro into vignettes in our last presentation. But let's talk more deeply and go into a little bit more depth about what a vignette is. So, what is a vignette? A vignette, pronunciation, vin-yet, is a short scene in literature that's used to describe a moment in time. Describe a moment in time. It is descriptive and creates an atmosphere around a character, an incident, an emotion, or a place. So you'll notice it doesn't have a specific purpose as far as when it's used, okay? It can be used to talk about a character or something that happened or a specific emotion or a specific place. Vignettes in that sense are very utilitarian. They can kind of do a lot with all kinds of different options, okay? Dictionary.com defines it as a small, graceful, literary sketch. It's also known as a slice of life, okay, that gives the reader added information. Okay, so we have added information, but it is not integral to the plot of the story. And so a vignette is almost like an aside or like a literary version of parentheses. Okay, so I'm going to tell you the story, and then I'm going to give you some additional context, or I'm going to give you some additional insight that you don't really need to understand the story, but it provides some additional depth or some additional meaning that would not have been there had the vignette not been included. A vignette can also be described as a pause. Okay, so it's essentially like, here's the story, it's going along, plot, 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 and then, oh, pause. Let me tell you a little bit more about that specific situation or that specific person. Okay, that's the vignette. Authors usually use vignette when they want to highlight a defining emotional moment in a character's life. Okay. If I think about different instances in my life that I could write a vignette about, there are some that come to mind because they play either a super emotional situation or there was something specifically impactful about something that happened. The one that I think of most often is sitting in the waiting room with my fiance at the time, right before we were about to go get married. And it was like a 5-minute just sitting there. But I think about all of the things that were going through my head and the conversation that we had and what I was wearing and what the weather was like and looking out the window. Like I can remember all of these things so vividly. And it's almost like that moment is this little vignette in my life. Now, if we look at the actual etymology of the word, vignette translates to or comes from little vine. And it's named after the decorative vine leaves that adorned 19th century books, like the one in the picture that you see. Like the vines that adorn the books, a vignette in literature adorns the story by enhancing a part of it. Now, if we're looking at literary specificity, a vignette is a short, well-written, descriptive passage. It's a form of personal narrative or story. It can be all kinds of things: a memory, a thought, a hope, a dream, or an idea. Furthermore, it does not have a plot. If it had a plot, it would be a short story, but it doesn't have a plot. But it does reveal something about the elements in it. It may reveal character, mood, or tone. It may have a theme. Okay, so interesting that it doesn't have a plot, but it could have a theme or an idea of its own to convey. It is the description of the scene or characters that is important. Okay, so description is where the meat of a vignette comes from. So if you're just going to give me the cat escaped the house, it got locked out, it got lost, it got stuck in the tree, its owner found it and saved it, that's pretty boring. You gotta give me the description, okay? The description is where we find the meaning. Now, the $1 million question. The House on Mango Street, so the text that we are reading, is a book made up entirely of vignettes. There is no cohesive story. There's no, exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution. There's no plot. It's simply a series of vignettes about one girl in particular, her family, her living situation, the neighbors that she has, the experiences that she has, but it isn't a cohesive story. So my question, and this is the question that you will find in the Canvas discussion, if vignettes don't have a plot and our whole book is vignettes, then how does that work? What can we gain? What's the point? What's the point? Why does the author write it? What are we trying to learn about it? What is she trying to teach us? What's the point? So with that, we will end, and you can head now to your Canvas discussion and answer this question. What do you think?